hard to see all my controls when I'm navigating here. As I was explaining, this is welcome to week 6 already. Wow, that's amazing. So this actually is one of my favorite topics, and I'll give you a little background on that later, but I just want to go through the presentation, then we'll discuss what's coming up for this week. Because, well, let me just go ahead and go through this real quick. I'm just curious. You're going to be required to do an implicit bias survey. So I want to start with just sort of touching on that a little bit. And why can I not? All right, so we're going to expand on this comes from the module itself, and discussing the need to expand on and facilitate cultural competence as educators in the healthcare field. Bastable mentions that the one downfall of integrating cultural assessments is the tendency to stereotype patients based on ethnic heritage or other attributes. Healthcare educators should not assume that learning needs are generalizable based on those qualities. I would argue this statement is just as true both in academia and professional environments. And the reason I bring that out is because one of the biggest, or I guess, issues that they get currently of course, in our country is the discussion about implicit bias. And how many of you remember when there were separate but equal bathrooms, schools? Have you ever known a time that you lived that existed? Nobody? Well, I happened to be in the first class of a fully integrated elementary school post the Civil Rights Act passage. So when I grew up, I came from California, which was fully integrated 20 years prior to North Carolina. When I came to North Carolina, it was 1968, and the school that I attended was originally the black school. I didn't know that. I actually didn't know that for years until after I got out of high school that I even realized that. And that was when I went to college. But what's interesting is we never knew any different. We grew up together. Everybody went to school together. But the classes ahead of us were segregated. So by the time we got to high school and we caught up with some of those that were fully segregated, that had reintegrated, the dynamic was very different in our class versus the senior class. Because the senior class, it was very, very apparent that they didn't get along. And they didn't appreciate us being friends, meaning in our case, black, white, and Indian. But we didn't know any different because that's just the way we grew up. You know, we started first grade together. We went through junior high together. We got into high school. That was the first time any racial issues ever came up. And, you know, reflecting back on that, it was an experience that I wouldn't trade for the world. But just to give you a little interesting side note, so my great-grandmother is Cherokee. So I get very dark in the summer. And in my 7th grade year, we were getting on the bus to go to some, I don't know, some type of event. I think it was, I think we're going to go to see PT 109 at the theater because it was about John F. Kennedy and we were studying World War II. And so we get on the bus and we're all sitting there waiting to get on the bus. And of course, this is back in the day when buses had no air conditioning and they were very basic transportation. And at that time, there was the American Indian, there was an American Indian reparations program going on. So because of the background of the United States and what they did to the American Indian population, what they decided to do was create a federal program to provide, we'll say, advantages for American Indians, such as they would have a bus that was air conditioned. It was the first air conditioned bus in our county. So they were provided an air conditioned bus. They were provided with all supplies for school and sports. So we get on the bus, right? And I was, I grew up on a farm, so I was out in the field 15, 16 hours a day easily. And so I get on the bus, and the teacher gets on and says, all the American Indian students need to get off the bus and go to the bus up front. And I thought that was kind of odd, but I thought, okay, whatever. And so one of my friends turned to me. She said, "Well, aren't you coming?" And I went, "What do you mean?" And she says, "Well, you're darker than I am. You need to be coming with us." And I laughed and I said, "Well, the bottom line is," I said, "my birth certificate says I'm white, even though my great grandmother was Cherokee." And she just laughed and went on. But she was right. I mean, I was darker than her by several shades. And I'm not talking about, just a little bit. It was significant. And because I always had questions about my ethnicity growing up, because I would get super dark and people would ask me, I mean, point blank to my face, "What are you?" And, my parents, or I say my parents, my family in particular would chide me a little bit, because I was darker than everybody else in my family. And I mean, they was in jest, but the point is that from that point, I realized that there was a difference that people recognized. I didn't care. I actually liked it. I thought it was kind of cool, growing up. But as I got older, I also saw, where things could go wrong by assuming certain things. I mean, I've been called everything from Indian to what was something somebody called me one time, and not Arabic, but anyway, it was totally not even close, but it was totally based on appearance. I just thought it was odd. But here's the question. We need to talk about how to eliminate judgment and bias, since we're all human. And you remember, if we go back to the first conversation we had about the square of common good, we talked about respect, compassion, integrity, and justice. Those were the 4 pillars of the square of common good. If we start from that perspective and we move forward, we don't have to worry about understanding everything about another person. We simply begin with respect, regardless of where they come from. If we begin with that, then everything flows from that. Because if we respect them as a human being, then we can effectively be compassionate towards them. But that requires that we operate with integrity towards them by falling back on our personal values. And then they will get the justice that they deserve. And education really is about trying to equalize things to some degree, but it's not perfect. In other words, sometimes people still feel left out. And I have tons of stories about, because again, growing up where I grew up in the South, and growing up in being the first class of fully integrated students, we had experiences that probably no one else would ever have, because it was the first time we were mixed together, and it was an experiment for all intents and purposes. But we all grew up, we learned to respect each other naturally, and because our teachers demanded it. Our teachers were Black, white, Indian, it didn't matter. They wouldn't let us call each other names, even though we would call each other names. They would straighten us out in a heartbeat, because they had respect for each other. And when I think back on those experiences, it was something that sort of fed me through my lifetime. Because even today, when I see people, that I haven't seen in a while from from high school, we kind of pick up where we left off. We don't really, there's none of this black and white separate thing that went on. But through teaching, I've experienced things that sort of enlightened me to realize that even though I realized those things early on, I still had work to do, because we all come with implicit bias. I don't care who you are, everybody has it. So when you take that implicit bias test, I will tell you, you have implicit bias. You don't have to take the test for me to tell you that, but it will sort of reveal to you what those implicit biases are. You've probably heard this phrase. This is probably one of the better phrases for education. Give them a fish and feed them for today. Teach them to fish, then you feed them for a lifetime. Now, some say it was a Chinese proverb. Some say it's an Italian adage. Some say it's a Native American saying. Who knows? Who was it really that said that? It was actually Anna Isabella Thackeray Ritchie. That was who's credited for it from history. But you'll notice that everybody else who gets credit are men. It wasn't uncommon for that to happen before the women's suffrage movement. So it doesn't matter. The reality is that the saying has substantial meaning. If we give students or staff, if you will, just sort of hand them everything and not make them work for it, they're not going to learn how to take care of themselves when it comes to learning. I told my students the very first day of class every year, my job is to help you learn how to learn. Because you're going to take 2 years, or in our case, 2 years to learn respiratory therapy, but you're going to spend a lifetime learning how to be a respiratory therapist, and it's never going to stop. But once it stops, I'll use a term, not a term, but a phrase or a quote: "When you're green, you're growing. When you're ripe, you rot." Do you know who said that? How many of you have ever eaten at McDonald's? It was Ray Kroc. It was the founder of McDonald's. I think he failed at more than 50 businesses before he was successful. His wife was ready to leave him. But he always believed if you basically stay green, if you always think of yourself as, what I call coming to the table with a beginner's mind, you'll never be so arrogant that you can't learn something. And I can tell you, without even asking, you've seen therapists that way. They're so arrogant, they can't learn anymore because they think they know it all. And from my experience with the board, that is the most dangerous person on the floor, because they will make a mistake that will hurt someone. And I've seen it. We had a couple of years ago, we had a patient that, a practitioner who went to 3 different doctors to get something ordered on a patient because he thought it was the right thing to do. Well, that's okay. But when they all denied him, he did it anyway. And he sat there in front of the board and told them that he would do it again. So we suspended his license because he was effectively practicing medicine without a license. And it worked out in this case, but it could have worked out in a very different scenario. And, I've always viewed respiratory therapists as not the person who's going to always get their way, but you're going to give them your best advice. If the doctor doesn't want it, there's not a whole lot you can do. You advocate for your patient, but you can't demand from the physician that they do what you say. But some people feel that's what should happen. If you ever get on some of these Facebook pages, people will talk about that, and there's some truth to it. When you've got a resident who, whatever drug comes out, they order that same drug on every patient they can find, because that's what they learned in med school that day. And we sort of joke around about it. But, some people have a real negative view of that. And I always viewed it like, well, I'm a consultant. I'm there to give them my best advice. If they don't follow it, there's nothing I can do. I'm going to do the best I can for the patient. And most of the time, if you take that approach, though, what will happen is that the physician will listen to you. But I worked at a facility where everybody always, this was their advice consistently. let's discontinue this medication. Let's discontinue this treatment. It was never, let's try this medication or let's try this therapy. It was always, let's discontinue something. And so my approach was go to the physician, we're not making progress, suggest something else, and they were more likely to listen to you because you were being considerate of what was going on with the patient rather than yourself. But anyway, I digress. So let's talk a little bit about implicit bias. Do you express it in any way? Do you see diversity on this page? Thumbs up. Diversity? Yes? Okay. Okay. Do you know anything about these people? Do you know what their thoughts are? Or their ideas, educational levels, background? Do you know anything about their home life? One of the implicit bias factors is that we judge people on the outward appearance rather than the inward appearance. Because when you think about it, and we all know this, everybody bleeds red, right? You do a blood gas, well, obviously some blood is not darker than others, but I mean, that's because of lack of oxygen. But the point is that everybody bleeds red. And when you pull away the skin, you can find what's underneath, but you really don't know anything about that person. So what's similar and dissimilar about this group? What do you think? If you had to categorize these two groups of people, what would be your best guess?
Not Caucasian.
Okay, not Caucasian. Okay. Based on some of the headdresses and just some of the general features of the lower picture, what would you surmise that these individuals might be, where they might be from?
The continent of Asia.
Very good. What about top?
North America.
And North American what?
American Indians.
Right. But they're both Indian, right? One is you have Asian Indians, right, from the continent of Asia, which most people don't think about that. And then you have the American Indian. Now, if you took the American Indian and also the Hispanic population of South America, there would be a lot of similarities there because they were all American at one point. They were all different tribes of the Americas. We only call it North America and South America because that's the way we've sort of devised it. That has nothing to do with who the people actually are. And, the Hispanic population that merged with the Native Americans of the southern region, of course, they intermarried, just like they did in the United States. So you have a real big mixture of peoples. So, when you think about Spain, most people don't really think about this, but Spain, for hundreds of years was, pillaging the South American continent. But they also settled there, integrated there. Did you know that almost 90% of the American native population, after about 200 years of Spanish rule, was gone? Because they died mainly of disease. Some of war, but a lot by disease, because the Spanish brought diseases that they had never been exposed to. I guess the point is you have different types of Indian populations. You have our American Indian, you have the Asian, or what sometimes people refer to as Eastern Asian, Eastern Asian Indian, which brings us to this. Is there a connection between these two groups? Of course, because they're both on the Asian continent, right? But when you look at one group, you see very dark skin. When you see on the top group, you see very light skin, right? So there's always an implicit bias that, well, I think most clearly people at the, would look at the top picture and say clearly they're Asian, right? Because that's what you picture as Asian. But was it Naomi? Who was it that said that the bottom one was? Yeah, okay, I thought so. So most people don't think of the Indians from India as Asian, but they're on the same continent. I just think it's fascinating when you really start thinking about who people really are. You can't tell a thing really, because you don't know if the group up top, they could be second and third generation Asian families in America. So yes, they're Asian, but they've been in America so long, they don't have the values that they have necessarily of their home country or their parents' home country, their grandparents' home country. My daughter-in-law is first generation Hmong. And, you know, she still holds on to many of the values and language of her home country because her mother and father came from the Vietnam, and she was born here in the United States, but she's that first generation. And it's interesting because the further they get away from their origination, meaning first generation, second generation, third generation, and they become integrated into the population, things change. And even though their outward appearance might be similar to what their original, you know, their ancestors, how they view things are very different. And I think that's important. So where are we here? Does anyone have a guess?
South Africa.
You're on it, Naomi. Yes, absolutely. What you have here are two classes of students, both from South Africa. One, you have a white and black, and that's because they're still segregated. Post-apartheid, if you ever really want to have any appreciation for what's happened in the United States, is to look at what apartheid and post-apartheid Africa is like. It's shocking. But nevertheless, you can't really tell, you know, other than the fact that, you know, they're children, they're either light skin, dark skin, whatever, but you can't really tell anything about them. But how did you know they were from South Africa, by the way, Naomi?
My geography is legit.
Okay, that sounds like it. This will be a little challenging for you then, Naomi. I'll ask you. We have two nightclub scenes here. I'll tell you, one is from the US and the other one is not.
Russia.
Close.
Check.
Getting closer.
Croatia.
Yeah, just about there.
Oh. Ibiza?
I'm sorry, what?
I'm going to go way over to Ibiza.
Yo. Getting me. It's Albanian. This is your Albanian youth here. And what's interesting about this picture, though, is that you will the lower picture. What you'll notice about the Albanian youth, if you spend any time over there, this is probably in Tirana, which is their capital, but you would not see this in any of the other cities. You do not see male and female unless they're married together in public. In most parts of Albania, they're very traditional. But really, if you look at the pictures, I mean, you can see now, probably, particularly with, you know, if you know that, you know, you had it pretty close, Naomi, because they're really from the Baltic region, which the Czech Republic and, you know, the Baltic states are very close in terms of features. But it's really hard, to be honest with you, if you don't know their features. And but what was interesting when we were in Albania is how public displays of affection, or PDA, was not allowed at all. My son went with me my second year I went over. He came with me. He was 21 at the time, and he had a date. We got him a date with my interpreter. She was a nursing student, and the whole family came for the date. So he got a real education in what it was like to date someone in a foreign country. The date lasted about an hour. He came back and I said, what was wrong? He said, no, nothing. We're just, I'm going to go with her brother and we're going to go play pool. And so their date lasted an hour. He spent about the next 4 hours with her brother playing pool and drinking raki. And he came stumbling into the room later on that night. Raki is equivalent to Everclear. But anyway, it was a cultural immersion for him, so to speak. All right, so we have two pictures here. Naomi, I'm going to call on you since you've been hitting it pretty much out of the park on this one, unless somebody else wants to try. Any
Romania.
guesses? Oh, you're close.
Oh.
Very close. But I'll explain why you think it's
Serbia.
Romania. What was that?
Serbia?
Well, again, pretty close. To the right are traditional Albanian dress for they use when they do their cultural events. That's their traditional dress. To the left is a Turkish dress. Do you see any similarities in the two? And this all goes back to why you said what you said, Naomi, by the way. But whether it was Romania, Albania, or any of the Baltic states, the Turkish influence, because Turks came in and ruled that whole area for hundreds of years. And so their influences, particularly in dress, coffee, Turkish coffee, in all of these Baltic regions are very similar, whether it's Kosovo, Albania, Serbia, all of these have very similar cultures because they were influenced by the Turks. And then, of course, when communism came in and the Germans came in, that influenced them as well. But here's what's interesting is when we were in Albania, they would, if we even suggested that, oh, I can see the Turkish influence, they said, no, that's Albanian. They're very proud of their heritage, even though their heritage is influenced by multiple cultures. First by the Roman, and well, their culture predates the Roman Empire by more than 500 years. We actually were able to see a mosque that was built pre-Roman rule. So we're talking almost 2,500 years ago. And it was amazing to see the relics in that mosque. We were very few Americans or Westerners, period, had ever seen it. Any guesses as to where we are here? This is a harder one. Okay, and this actually gets to what one point I wanted to make about implicit bias. So years ago, I was in class, and as we do oftentimes we would do in class, we'd present a case. And how you generally present a case, you start out with, we have a 35-year-old African-American male, or Caucasian, or whatever it is. We start out sort of in that same vein. And this particular student asked me, she said, why do we bring up race when we talk about patients in a clinical setting? And I said, well, simply it's because, it's an identifier. We need to know who we're talking to and about. If you get a report on somebody and it's a 35-year-old white male, but you go into the room and it's a 50-year-old black male, it's sort of your first indication that it's the wrong room, right? And so she understood that. And I said, well, let's just take, for example, the classroom. I said, let's look at the classroom that we have. And I said, we've got X number of African-American males, females, et cetera, et cetera. I thought I was going to have my head taken off. The first thing she said was, first of all, I am not African-American. I said, okay. She said, I am Dominican, just like that. And I said, you're right. I said, I do apologize for that. And it just dawned on me that I was basing the segmented class based on the color of the skin and not the ethnic origin. Her ethnic origin was more important to her. And she was absolutely 100% right. These are all people from the Dominican Republic. But you'll notice that were various shades of color. No one's of a absolute color of any particular one. It's either, you got lighter to darker. And if you think about race, when you think about the human race, we're just simply different shades of the same color. It's an adaptation. You think about the skin adaptation to the sun, and over time, it's just how the body develops. If you aren't exposed to the sun, your skin gets lighter, right? But in these countries where you have, particularly ones you get closer to the equator, it's a protective mechanism. So we're all the same race. We're just different shades of the same race. And I think if you really think about it, that's where we should start from. And a lot of times people tend to, pinpoint things and say this is based on this racial group, when it has nothing to do with the actual skin color, because they're basing it totally on skin color. It has more to do with a cultural influence of that individual. And American culture is different than Dominican culture and different than South American culture, et cetera, et cetera. And we have to realize and appreciate that. And we have to realize that we're going to have those biases. We have to then learn how to discard of those biases. And how do we do that? We simply start with, tell me about yourself. And that's the great thing about if you ever get a chance to do any cross-cultural exchanges, is that you just sort of take things as they come. Time in certain countries doesn't mean the same thing as it does in the United States. If we were told we were going to be picked up at 7 o'clock at night to go to dinner in Albania, count on 9 o'clock, because they're usually 2 hours. 2 hours was nothing to them. But for us, a 2-hour delay was monumental. We expected 7 o'clock to be picked up. So what we had to learn to do was go down to the cafe and have a drink and wait for them, because that's what they were going to do. We would end up eating at 11 o'clock at night. That was a big culture shock, but we learned to adapt because we were there in their country. Now, I've got a few videos in here that I'll post on we're not going to cover them out because it won't show up correctly on the presentation here, but why diversity matters. And then the other one is taking inclusion from theory to practice, how to be inclusive with everyone. And like I said, if you begin with the square of common good, you'll sort of have a basis for how to approach it. For years, I taught I still advise on cultural diversity for the National Institute of Whole Health. And the rule of thumb is you just come with a beginner's mind. Whatever the culture is, just come with a beginner's mind, make no judgments, because it's part of the mindfulness process of acceptance. And I think that's where, for example, the Buddhist philosophy has probably one of the greatest values, because the whole purpose of mindfulness is to be non-judgmental. And if you can be non-judgmental, you can open your mind. And when you can open your mind, you can accept things for what they are. So these are short TED Talks, and I think they're really good, but for some of you to maybe look at. So this is actually the last class, I guess, because next week starts our final rush to the finals and getting the final paper and final projects, et cetera. So I don't want to take up your time next week, because I know we'll be trying to finish. So I'll end with this. What is luck? Learning under correct knowledge. That was an acronym meaning that I came up with years ago with my students, because I would ask them, what does luck mean to you? Do you wish somebody luck? What are you really saying? And for me, I always like to find acronyms and use them sort of in a positive way. And I've always felt like this was sort of one of those. Was, what does luck really mean? If you have wished someone luck, you wish that they learn under correct knowledge. And for my students, I always hoped that wherever they ended up is that they were going to be operating under that correct knowledge and that they would continue to learn. So what questions do you have? No questions about the presentation or anything? I don't see Shandy on here. Did she get off? She had a question earlier I thought was good. Shandy asked a question earlier, and Darren, if you could probably remind me exactly what she said, but basically, what should you be doing for the presentation? You did sort of a preview last week, and then for this part is you're going to be adding the additional information in the actual education portion. So, you know, you've got 6 slides, 7 slides now from last week, then you should probably add another 7 or 8 slides probably to get through the rest, and go from, you know, taking it to full fruition. Now, will it have to do with your, some people ask the question, you know, just in emails to me about, does it have to be your capstone? And the answer is, of course not. But it's helpful if it's your capstone because that's what you know best. If you wanted to do it on something completely different, at this point, it might be a little more difficult to do, but possible. And it doesn't have to be the entire capstone. It can be part of the capstone. It can be a fraction of the capstone. But if you've gotten this far and you've sort of worked on it, I wouldn't change gears right now. I would stay the course and keep with it, because I think you would probably be doing yourself a disservice, but that's totally your option. The goal is to present something that your peers can evaluate and you can do a pre and post test on. You know what you know about your project and stick with it. Because I know a lot of you have worked already very hard on it. And it's been kind of difficult to try to figure out what, how to sort of incorporate this. But that was the challenge, you know, to figure out, you know, what part of your capstone could you present at this point. You won't have certain data available if you have a, you know, if you're doing a capstone that requires significant data collection and analysis, you obviously can't present that, but you can present the content. And then what you would do is, you know, sort of at the end and at the conclusion, you know, upon gathering the information, this is maybe how I would predict that, you know, it might go. In other words, you are presenting your hypothesis, and eventually in your capstone, you're going to be proving your hypothesis, I hope, or maybe disproving your hypothesis as well. Because if you do it, like, for example, if you do a correlation study, it's possible that you won't find any correlation. When I got to my dissertation and I did all my statistics, I found no correlation from what I was looking for. I was devastated because I thought, I knew I was right, but I had to go look a little deeper into the statistics to find something that was valuable that I did glean from it. And I did. And I was like, it took me a couple of days after I got all my statistics calculated and I checked in with my advisor. I was just so upset. And she said, well, look, you know, the point of it is that you either find something or you don't. And either way, it's right. And that's the good thing. So you may find at the end of your capstone that whatever your hypothesis is that you're trying to prove can't be proven. And that's okay too, because then you eliminate that. In some cases, you know, if you're doing an education program on something, you can deliver that education program, but maybe the outcome of that program isn't what you want. But that doesn't mean that you haven't gained something or gleaned something from it valuable. There's always something valuable in the process. I'm a big process. I believe in the process. You start the process, you work through the process, you let the process teach you. And you may not find what you think you're going to find, but that's okay, because that's the process. Any questions?
Dr. Croft.
Mm-hmm. Who said that?
Go ahead, Amy.
Huh?
Amy?
Heather, do you want me to go?
Yes, go ahead, and I'll ask after you.
So Dr. Croft, we did the previous PowerPoint presentation and you want us to add to that? Because I didn't think us presenting the educational model to whoever the audience may be included, talking about the evaluation plan or.
No, you don't have to do that. I'm sorry. In some cases it might be, because it depends on your project, because in some cases you're presenting to educators. So you would do that. In your case, you wouldn't do that necessarily. Okay. It just really depends on your project. You know, you can reflect back on that. For example, the objectives obviously should be there.
For sure, yes.
And those kind of things. And, what the goal is, what the purpose is certainly would be. But yeah, you wouldn't necessarily be talking about, if you're using cognitive theory or, or cognitive domains or whatever with a patient group, for example.
Yeah, that would be a whole different model.
Yeah.
For
No. But like I said, because you've got people teaching staff, students, faculty, it's sort of all over the map.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to teach them about that too.
No.
Okay. Thank you.
So,
Yeah.
Mr. Croft, I was asking because you mentioned in last week's submission that I put in that you had some ideas for me on my overview, and I was wondering if I could get those from you.
Yeah, let me pull it up real quick. Are you talking about your presentation or your paper?
The presentation, you said you had some ideas for my overview.
Oh, yeah. It's been so many papers ago. I'm going to have to go back and look at it. Hold on a second. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Let's see. I'm trying to do this without revealing your grade. So let me stop sharing for a second. I'll just. You can't see my screen, right?
No.
Okay, good. Okay. All right. So what I'm looking at, geez, I just could remember what I should have written that down actually. Well, I guess I thought I maybe had included in what I had written, but going back to using the assertion style PowerPoints is, in one of your slides, for example, you had wounds caused by NIV mask, for example, and I think you had below that you had what is it? Marukia, Michelle, oh boy, a lot of Italian names here. Facial skin breakdown in patients with non-invasive ventilation devices. Report of 2 case indications for treatment and prevention international. Okay, so there could be, for example, in a situation like that where you have cited something that's valuable, is to pull out from that particular citation, going to the actual article and pulling out a quote and making that the header for the slide. So that way you're presenting the actual evidence of, what's their main conclusion. I guess that's probably the best way to do it is to go to their main conclusion, and their main conclusion should be the top as the header for that slide. That's an example of how you could really make it impactful, because the picture of the wounds makes the point, but the conclusion of that article might really be impactful. You don't have to read it. You just have to, if you have it there, people can see the picture. They can read that point, that assertion, and they get it. It's bad, and we need to do something about it. And this way, you can speak from that without actually ever repeating what's on the slide, because you could, because the information. So you use that as a springboard to move forward with, how to present it. Because what you will find is when you use assertion style presentations, you will find it to be very freeing, because you have your main point on the screen that everybody can read. You can just talk all around it all day long. And people are going to be much more excited about seeing something like that than you reading a series of things.
Okay.
Although I do think the picture was very impressive because it really showed the problem associated with, wounds.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Uh-huh. Sorry, it took me a second to regroup there. After reading about 25 of those, it's hard to remember.
No, I get it. You got a lot of us. I get it. You got
Yeah.
a lot of us to go through, so.
Yeah, so and I had a procedure done on Friday, so I had propofol. And how many of you have ever had propofol? Oh, geez. That stuff will put you out in a heartbeat. But the only thing I remember was this massive headache and then waking up.
Yeah.
And I've had that headache ever since, unfortunately. So,
Does it burn as bad as we say when it goes in? I always
yes, it does.
It does.
I mean,
Yeah, it
and
does.
it just felt like my sinuses were just exploding, because I have sinus problems anyway, but it just felt like it just went like this in my head. And it was a little nerve wracking, but fortunately I didn't remember a darn thing. So that's good. That's all I remember. All right. So any other questions? All right. Well, I appreciate your time, and y'all have a good week and finish up. And I guess I won't be seeing you next week, but I appreciate your time and being here every week. Do appreciate it.